Well, I hope everyone survived the windstorm last night. By looking at this side of the auditorium, I suspect that some didn't, or some are dealing with power outages or trees down and so forth. I understand the south part of our city is much worse than the north part in terms of trees being on the ground and so forth. And I think that north of us, around Weatherford, they got it much more difficult than we. I understand that the Weatherford Church building, Church of Christ building, has most of its roof gone. That's what I've heard the last report. And their building is half flooded, and so they're not able to have services this morning. I understand the Baptist church here in town is without power. They were hoping to have it on by 10:30, and so hopefully they have that on this morning. But anyway, we're glad that you are here. And I know we have some who are traveling still from 4th of July holiday. I guess 4th of July happened last week, didn't it? I mean, that was just Tuesday, and it seems like forever ago to me. But it's a wonderful time of the year for people to be gone and to travel and so forth. We're going to begin this morning, John chapter 13. But as we begin John chapter 13, you have to understand that we're right at the end of the life of Jesus. What was it? 6 weeks ago or so, we were only in John chapter 12, the beginning of John chapter 12. And we learned at the beginning of John chapter 12, it was 6 days before the Passover. Then a few more verses later, in John chapter 12, we learned it was 5 days until the Passover, until Jesus would die. But now in John chapter 13, it's only a few hours. And yet, John will write about those few hours in chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and beyond. Because there are so many things that Jesus wants to say as final words in final hours. Now, I know that everyone in the audience agrees that in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, what we call the Sermon on the Mount, it's the greatest sermon ever preached. And we have often said that it's the thesis statement that Jesus gives for governing life in his kingdom. Or some of us might call it the constitution that Jesus would give for his constitution. How you and I are supposed to live inside of the kingdom. And they're extremely important words. But these words, beginning in John chapter 13, are also very, very important words. And yes, they are intended for the apostles. But what he says has much application to us. Jesus understands that he's going to die in just a little while. He understands that he'll be raised from the dead 3 days later. He understands and knows that for 40 days after that, he'll be seen by multitudes so they know that he was resurrected. He understands that he will be going into the heavens, ascending. But he also understands that at that point in time, he will leave in the hands of those apostles the keys of the kingdom. And the growth of this kingdom and the spreading of this kingdom has so much to do with those apostles. He's going to tell them, I want you to go into all the world. And I want you to teach people what I have taught you. And I want you to baptize people in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And I want you to begin here in Jerusalem. And then I want you to go throughout all of Judea. And I want you to go through Samaria. And I want you to go through all the world and do this. And they have a big task. And so Jesus is going to give final words during his final hours. Now, I don't have any illustrations, but I suspect some people have gone through this. Not all of us know when we're going to die, but there are some people who know when they're going to die. I tried to research that this week. I found, for example, the final moments before Michael Landon's death. Michael Landon, played on Bonanza and all those other shows. He was battling pancreatic cancer, and he was surrounded by all of his family. And one of his sons, I think a son, said, "Dad, it's okay to go on." And he said, "Yes, I know it's time, and I love every one of you." But can you imagine a Michael Landon or someone else knowing that the time is just a little ways away, and they bring in their children, maybe one at a time, maybe bring in spouse, and say, "Here's some things I want you to know." I just learned not long ago, one of my really close friends, one of my mentors, had a brain tumor, was an elder in one of the churches in Edmond. And he brought his wife in and said, "This house is way too big for you, and I want you to sell it immediately upon my death. And I want you to move over here and be taken care of like this." And she followed every instruction he gave to her. That's what Jesus is doing as we begin John chapter 13. So every word, and some of these words are deep and profound, and they're so deep and they're so profound as you get to like chapter 16 and 17 that we don't even talk about them very much. We don't even preach those lessons very often because they're so difficult for us to comprehend. But we start easy this morning. I was going to take John chapter 13, the first 17 verses. I was going to read all of those verses, and we were going to talk about that, and I decided it was too long, and it was too much, and there are too many different lessons in it. So I decided, let's make it more brief, and let's just take the first 3 verses. And so I want you to read with me the first 3 verses of John chapter 13 as Jesus begins these final words in his final hours. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and that he was returning to God. And you're probably wondering, what am I going to talk about in those 3 verses? I want to start with Judas. And what good can we say about Judas? And we are often really difficult with Judas. And we don't like the name Judas. And we don't name our children Judas. And yet what happened to Judas happens routinely to every one of us. Did you really catch that verse? I tried to emphasize a little bit. The devil had already prompted Judas. I like the word prompted, by the way. We would normally use, in some translations, the word tempted. But I like the word prompted. Because is it not true that the devil is prompting every one of us? And sometimes you and I are successful at fighting against the prompting. And sometimes we're not. It depends on the type of prompt that he uses. He prompted Eve in the garden, and Eve accepted his prompt and followed through. And he's done that over and over and over again in every life that's ever lived upon this earth. And so we know how the process of sin works. I want you to look again at James chapter 1, beginning in verse 13. We've talked about this many times, but it's worth remembering for the sake of this lesson. When tempted, no one should say, when prompted, no one should say, God is prompting me. God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person, each one of us, is tempted, is prompted, when we are dragged away by our own evil desire and enticed. And after that desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. That's the process. And everybody knows in this audience, except maybe a few who haven't heard it, I've used this illustration for years. You may grow tired of me using illustration, but it's the best I've got. I detest, everybody remember? Fishing. I'm sorry, Donnie, I don't like fishing. And I don't like fishing because my grandfather on my mother's side took me fishing a lot. I know you like fishing, okay? I don't like fishing because my grandfather had a routine. I suppose he probably wanted to go fishing. I suppose he probably thought it was going to entertain me. But this was absolutely without fault in what I'm saying. He would always go well prepared. So at a certain spot in his backyard up at Clinton, he would dig up a brown jar that contained stink bait. And you have to smell it to know it. He would rig up a cane pole for me that had a cork on it and a hook. He would take a couple of rods with reels on them. We would always stop by the bait shop. We would pick up a deal of worms, a can of worms. We would pick up a few minnows, and sometimes he would buy frozen shrimp. And we would go to a pond, or sometimes we'd go to the river, and we'd stick the cane in the ground and put the cork out there so we could see if it bobbed, and cast the rod out a ways. He'd put the weight on it, and we would sit there. And we would sit there. And then he would pull them back in, and he would change the bait, and he would throw it back out. We would sit there. Now, my problem was we always went home empty-handed. And I go home thinking, we wasted half a day. This is really boring stuff. But he apparently had success along the way in days gone by because he knew that if he kept changing the bait, at some point he would get just the right bait. He might even find a grasshopper. If we were out there somewhere, he would see a grasshopper. He'd grab a grasshopper and thread it on that hook. I don't want to say that fishermen are kind of like, well, I better not go there. But do you know how deceitful they are? They take a vicious hook and camouflage it with a worm or a grasshopper or a minnow and put it out there to catch this poor fish. And Satan does the very same thing to Judas. Because he figured out what Judas really liked. Judas wasn't all bad. There were some things that Judas would not be affected by. But it was 6 weeks ago or so that we were at the beginning of John chapter 12, and we saw Jesus in the home of Lazarus and Martha and Mary after Lazarus had been raised from the dead. And we saw Mary, and we talked about her gratitude and her generosity, and we compared her to Judas, who was in the crowd, and we compared her to Judas's greed, because he was the keeper of the bag. He kept the money for the group. He would reach into the bag and take out the money he wanted from time to time. His love for money was his greatest weakness, and Satan knew it. And Satan had prompted him. So that as you're reading this in John chapter 13, he has apparently already gone to the chief priest. And he's already made a deal. I'll tell you his identity. You give me in return 30 pieces of really pure silver. He followed through. And what you have to understand is that everyone else has also. Everyone else has also. Everybody understand that? All are guilty. All have been prompted. All have come short. And all have sinned. Now, that hard part's out of the way. Look at the next part. Look at what Jesus knows. Not only does he know about Judas, but look at some of the other things he knows in verses 1 and 3 as Bert puts those together on the screen. He knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world. He knew he was going to die in just a little while. We're talking about a few hours. He knew he was going to die. Then he knew that God had given him all power. And that he had come from God and was going to return to God, but God had given him all power. That means Jesus knew he had the power to stop this stuff. He had this power to stop this thing that was going on. He had the power to do anything he wanted to do. And why didn't he? Why didn't he stop it? Well, did you catch that phrase back in verse 1 about his love? He loved those who had been given to him from the beginning, and he loved them to the end. Now, I don't know. I don't have a clue. I'm not smart enough to know what it means, those who have been given to him. But I do know this for truth, that every person alive today, as well as every person who's ever lived on this earth, has been created in the image of God. Every single one. It doesn't make any difference what social standing you have, or economic standing you have, or color of your skin, or where you are on this earth in terms of where you live. None of that makes any difference. Our world wants to make you think that there are more differences. They like to use the word racism a lot. They like to use the word white privilege a lot, and white supremacy a lot. I'm going to tell you, in the kingdom of God, in the kingdom of Jesus, there is none of that. If there is, it is so absolutely wrong. It's so absolutely wrong. Because we of all people know that every single person was created in the image of God. And every single person is loved by God. No matter what you've done, no matter where you've lived, or where you do live, or what you look like, or if you have no money, or if you have a lot of money, it's equal. We're all loved by God. We're made in His image. And Jesus loves them, or loves us, to the end. He had the power to stop it. He knew he had the power to stop it. But he loved us to the end. That means he's going to love us all the way to the point that he'll die on that cross. Because he knows when I am prompted and I follow through with that prompting and I commit sin, that I am separated from God because of God's holiness. And I'm on a pathway of destruction that I can't get off of by myself. And if I stay on that pathway of destruction that I can't get off of by myself, I end up in a really horrible situation. And God didn't design us for that. He didn't want us to go through all that. And Jesus knew he was the only answer to stopping that. And he so loved this world. And he so loved all of us that he loved us all the way to the end. And he will die so that his blood will cause God to look at each one of us and say, yes, you did let desire get out of control. Yes, you were prompted and you failed. But you are a part of my body, and my son's blood has covered you, and my son is going to tell you in the end, you're going to be okay. And that's the story of the gospel. That's the entire story of the Bible in the first 3 verses of John chapter 13. Isn't that interesting? How over and over and over again you find in little tiny segments of the scriptures the whole story. We've just rehearsed the whole story of man's plight and God's love and Jesus' response to that love and Jesus holding on to that love all the way to the end so that my sins can be gone. So it seems appropriate that we stop and we take the Lord's Supper. I'll come back with a bit more to say, but it seems appropriate that we remember that he loved us. Anybody here feel unloved this morning? Anybody here feel unappreciated this morning? Anyone listening feel like that? He loves you with all of his might, and that's great. That's a great amount.